morning, church. How's everybody doing? Good. My name is Russ. I'm the lead pastor here, and I'm so excited to be able to welcome you to worship. Before we get started, have some very important business that we need to get out of the way. So let's just do it now. How many people want the Bengals to win? Yeah, a few of you. Okay. How many people want the Rams to win? Okay, yeah, there's a few more. How many people are just watching for the commercials? Yeah, that seems to be the majority of you. How many people are really excited about the halftime show concert? Yeah, yep. How many people have no idea what I'm talking about today? Anybody? No. A few of you. Okay, good. All right. Well, it's good to know who I'm talking to, who I'm. Anyway, we're glad that you were here. As you just saw, we're wrapping up a series that we've been doing for the last several weeks that we're calling Holy Interruptions. And what we're doing is we're looking at several different call stories of people in the Bible, people, ordinary men and women, people like you and me that sort of had their life interrupted, right? That God came and sort of tapped them on the shoulder and says, I have something that I need you to do. So there's this theme. There's this theme that happens over and over again, that God interrupts the lives of people like us and calls us to a life of service and asks that we partner with God to help bring heaven to earth. And so that's what we've been talking about the last several weeks. We started by looking at the story of Abraham, and then we looked at Samuel. We looked at the story of Esther. We looked at the story of Jonah, which is a great story. Last week, we looked at Mary Magdalene. Now, this week is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to warn you now. Not warn you, but just kind of give you a heads up. Now, we all have people in our lives, right, that we look up to. Sort of mentors, you might say. People whose lives we respect. People that we want to emulate. Maybe that person is somebody that we work with that's sort of a mentor for our careers. Maybe that person is somebody who's just, if you just think, I mentioned last week that I really want to be like Stephanie Horde when I grow up. That's sort of my spiritual mentor because not only is she an amazing musician, but she is probably one of the nicest people that I've ever met. A whole lot nicer than Shannon Moore. And so... Just kidding. I'm just making sure you're paying attention back there, Shannon. So we all have these people that we look up to that we want to emulate, people that we want to be like. And the same is true for our faith, right? We have people who we see that they just, you just want their faith. You want to live in the same way that they live, to emulate sort of who they are when it comes to their faith. And so this morning, that's sort of what we're going to look at. We're going to look at an example of how Jesus' followers are expected to live, okay? So that's what we're going to talk about. Now, as I pointed out last week, we have essentially 4 different accounts of the life of Jesus. We call them Gospels. And there's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And those are oftentimes referred to as the synoptics. It's from a Greek, Latin word, synopticus, that sort of means all seen together. Think of a synopsis of a book. And then there's the 4th gospel, which is John's gospel. And the synoptics are very similar in that they have basically the same stories. They use a lot of the same language. In fact, some of the wording is exactly the same, which leads us to think that some of the gospel writers were sort of cheating off each other's paper, just sort of picked it up, copy and paste, and put it over there. But yet, John's gospel is different. It's much more poetic. It's much more symbolic. It's sort of a literary masterpiece, if you will. And there's several things, too, that are a little bit different in that there is this rhythmic repetition that happens over and over in John's gospel that sort of draws us into the story, draws us into this vortex of light and life. For instance, rather than starting with a birth story, as some of the other gospels do, that talks about the origins of Jesus, it starts by saying, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, right? So John uses symbolism and imagery to help draw us into the story and to help drive home some of what he thinks to be the important theological and Christological points. So, as we saw, too, with Mary Magdalene last week, John creates this image where the disciples and Jesus have this connection, this intimate connection. that we saw, like I said, last week with Mary Magdalene. What's interesting is in the synoptic Gospels, Peter is sort of the main disciple, right? The one that the story, sort of the one who takes center stage. Not necessarily more so than Jesus, but is sort of like the best supporting actor, I guess you could say. But in John's gospel, it's another disciple that sort of is taken center stage. But what's interesting is that we don't know this disciple's name, because never in the entire gospel are we told. It simply refers to this person as the one whom Jesus loved. Now, scholars have started referring to this person as the beloved disciple, and we don't know who this is. But it's a fascinating way for us to draw us into the story and sets us up as a prime example of what a disciple should look like. Now, what's interesting is he doesn't show up. This beloved disciple doesn't show up until the 13th chapter. That's where we're going to pick up the story today. He just sort of shows up there at the Last Supper, and but yet sticks around through the end of the story and plays an important role through the rest of the story. Now, that night, they were all gathered together. Jesus knew that this was going to be the last time that he had with him, that he was going to be betrayed that night. He knew that the next day had some pretty heavy stuff that was about to happen, and so he was trying to use that night, that Last Supper, as a way to remind them, to leave them with a searing image that will help them live without him. And so what he does is, in the middle of this meal, he just sort of gets up and he walks over and he picks up a basin of water and a towel, and he assumes the role of a slave and he starts washing their feet. Now, folks, I don't have the language to be able to articulate how shocking and how scandalous, for lack of a better term, that would have been for someone who was a lord, these people that had followed him, that now all of a sudden he is washing their feet. Well, that's where we pick up the story this morning, and so I'm going to ask Stacy to share with us this reading from John's Gospel.
From John 13. After he had finished washing their feet, he took his robe, put it back on, and went back to his place at the table. Then he said, "Do you understand what I have done to you? You address me as teacher and master, and rightly so. That is what I am. So if I, the master and teacher, washed your feet, you must now wash each other's feet. I've laid down a pattern for you. What I've done, you do." After he said these things, Jesus became visibly upset, and then he told them why. "One of you is going to betray me." He said these things, one of you is going to betray me. The disciples looked around at one another, wondering who on earth he was talking about. A little later, Jesus said to them, "Let me give you a new command. Love one another in the same way I loved you. You love one another. This is how everyone will recognize that you are my disciples, when they see the love you have for each other."
This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Now, I know what you're thinking. Russ, this is different than any of the other call stories that we've talked about. There's not really a call that is placed upon anyone's life in this story, and I suppose that that's true. What I want us to do as we sort of wrap up this series is to look at this example of how that relationship that the beloved disciple had with Jesus enabled him to respond to the call that has been placed upon his life. Because I believe that we are all called in some way, shape, or form. We are all called to follow Jesus. We are all called to be disciples. Now, I mentioned that the beloved disciple is never cited by name. Never throughout the entire gospel. He's only referred to as the one whom Jesus loved. And scholars and Christians have been arguing and debating over who that person is for centuries. And a lot of scholars think that it was probably John, the one who is the author of the gospel, right? Because in John's gospel, he's sort of the lead disciple of all the others. So maybe it was John. Some other people think, well, maybe it was Lazarus. Because Lazarus, you may remember the story, Jesus comes upon him and he's died. And when he finds out that Lazarus has died, he weeps. He weeps. And so maybe it was Lazarus, the one that he later, in that moment, raised from the dead. Some other people think that maybe it was Jesus' brother, James, that he was the one. And still other scholars believe that it was Mary Magdalene, that she was the one whom Jesus loved. Well, you could debate and you could say, well, look here and you can look there and you can make all sorts of different announcements and arguments as to why each of those could be true, and any of them could be true. But the truth is that we don't know. There's no proof in any way, shape, or form. But other scholars believe, and this is where I hang my hat, this is what I believe as well, is that John intentionally doesn't link this person. In part because the way that he draws us into the story is wondering who that disciple could be. And maybe what he's saying is that each of us are the beloved disciple. What he's suggesting is that you are the one that Jesus loves. Now, when we look at it in that way, doesn't the story just sort of open up in new and exciting ways? Jesus says, I have set for you an example that you should do as I have done to you, he says, after having washed their feet. In the Synoptic Gospels, as I said, it's a little bit more of a story, more like a journalist type thing that's telling the story. And he says over and over again that we are to serve others. That he came as a servant to others, and that we should follow in his footsteps, and that we should serve others. And there's another part in another one of the Synoptic Gospels where two of the disciples are fighting over who's the best and who's the greatest. And he says, no, you guys got it both wrong. Both of you are wrong. The one who wants to be first needs to be last. And if you want to be the greatest among you, then become a servant, right? That's how Jesus talks. That's the language that he uses in the Synoptic Gospels. But in John's Gospel, John knows that actions speak louder than words. And so what he does is he gives them an example of this is what it looks like. This is what it looks like. He wants to leave them with a lasting impression, this searing memory in their minds before he goes away. That this is what it means to be a follower of Jesus. So he's very intentional about that. He wants to show them, not just tell them. And so that night, as they gathered together around the table, the creator of the universe, the Lord and Savior of all, gets down on his knees and washes his followers' feet. And the next day, of course, he would lay down that basin and that towel, and he would pick up a cross, and he would literally lay down his life for them. This is what it means to be a servant. Where we picked up the story was that he had just finished washing the disciples' feet. And so what's fascinating about this is that it said, I don't know if you saw this, but the one whom Jesus loved reclined next to him. Did you pick that up? That he reclined next to him. Now, what's fascinating to me in this is that in that time, in that culture, that people, when they would gather together for meals, they didn't use chairs like we are sitting in this morning, right? The tables were all much lower, and so they would recline on pillows. They had these big pillows, and they would just sort of recline back with their legs kind of tucked in beside them, and that would allow them to sit closer together than opposed to, laying horizontally. They can kind of wrap themselves around, which would allow more and more people to be welcome at the table, that more and more people could be closer together. Now, in this time of pandemic with social distancing, that just feels awkward, doesn't it? That just like you can't sit that close to everybody. But in that time, that's the way that they did it. Now, as we might imagine, in John's gospel, those words, recline next to him, there is a deeper and more symbolic understanding of what those words mean. Now, I'm going to get a little technical here for a minute, so bear with me. Those words that are translated next to them in Greek are en tokopo tu lezu. Let me hear you say that. En tokopo tu lezu. You should be writing this down because this will be on the final exam, okay? So I need you to pay attention now. Now, the en is translated in or against or near, and the to is the, and to Jesu is of Jesus, right? Okay? But yet there are a couple of different alternative translations for that word kolpos. Let me hear you say kolpos. That's a little easier to say than the whole sentence. I should have started with that. I apologize. So that word kolpos can be translated a couple different ways. Oftentimes it can mean side, right, next to the side, but it can also mean heart or breast or bosom. And so if you look at it that way, it could be translated, the one whom Jesus loved was leaning against his heart, right? Or was leaning into Jesus' heart. In fact, the King James Version says, now there was leaning on Jesus' bosom one of his disciples whom Jesus loved, right? So there's this notion that he could be leaning in. Now, what I mentioned is that in John's gospel, that it begins with this bold statement, this theological, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. And it was John's way of saying that God and Jesus are one. They are one and the same. It's the same person, that this Jesus character is fully divine, fully human, but at the same time fully divine. And he is the author of life, the one that is called, that was created, that came into the world to bring light in the midst of this dark world. And a little later in that prologue to John, that introduction type sum, John says this: no one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known. That phrase there, close to the Father's heart, guess what that is in Greek? Entokopos. Exactly. You see, Jesus, God incarnate, who was so close to the Father's heart, has this similar intimate relationship with his followers as he has with God, right? That the one he loves leans into Jesus' breast, occupying the same level of intimacy with his Lord as he experienced with his Father, right? So here we are, leaning against Jesus' breast, leaning into the heart of the one who brings us life, who sacrificially washes our feet and brings light into our darkness. It's leaning into the heart of Jesus that we experience this divine love and this desire to make that love known in the world around us. About 20 years ago, there was this group of women that had gone to worship together in a service much like this. And as they were leaving that morning, they were all walking out in the parking lot together, and they saw this woman across the parking lot, sort of standing on the curb at the edge of the parking lot. And they recognized that this is a woman that had been in worship with them for the last several weeks. And as they looked, they noticed that she was weeping. And so they felt compelled, and they went over there, and they asked her if everything was okay, but obviously everything was not okay. And they noticed in that moment that she had a fist full of money. Well, they asked her if everything was okay and what they can do and how can they be helpful. And she explained that her name was Amy, and that she had been coming to this church, just like they thought, for the last several weeks. And that she loved God, and that for the first time in her life, she knew that God loved her. This was a revelation. And she said, I came today and I wanted to put this money in the offering plate, but I can't. I can't because it's dirty money. She went on to explain that she was an exotic dancer and that she had been trafficked into that life by a relative in a much younger age, and that she had been doing that her whole life, and it was all that she knew. And that she desperately wanted that line of work, that she desperately wanted a new way of being in this world, but she didn't know how. She didn't have the resources. She didn't have the ability to imagine anything else. It was all she'd ever known. Well, this group of 5 women decided in that moment, they were compelled, and they decided that they were going to help her, and they made a commitment to her in that moment that we will walk with you to help you in any way that we can. And so over the next several weeks, they surrounded her with love and with acceptance and with grace. They helped her financially so that she could sort of leave that business and sort of start fresh, get her feet underneath her. They helped her find the resources that she needed, agencies and other things that would help her get the help that she needed. They helped her get her GED so that she could begin her new life together, all within the next several months. Now, some of her former coworkers heard what they were doing for her and wanted the same thing. They wanted a fresh start. They wanted a new life. And so they started coming and said, is there any way that you can help us? And so over the next several weeks and months and now years, that has grown into a ministry. That has grown into a ministry that is called New Life, New Friends, New Life. And it helps sexually trafficked women and teens and their children. And it serves over 1,200 people every year. And this organization is in Dallas, Texas, not too far from here. And it all started because this group of women were willing to take the risk to roll up their sleeves and to wash some feet. So here's what I believe more than anything else, is that every single one of us has a call that has been placed upon our lives. That we are called, if nothing else, than to simply follow Jesus. And our call as followers of Jesus is to lean into the heart of Jesus Christ. To lean into the heart of Christ so that we can be close to him, so that others can see by the connection, by the relationship, by the love that we have for Jesus. Others can see in our words and in our deeds that we indeed are followers, if nothing else in our life. If that is our only call in life, that would be enough. If you do this, he says, if you live like this, if you lean in, everyone will know that you belong to me. And I know that the tendency, the human tendency, the draw of the human heart is to go the other way. We would much rather be served than to serve. But yet, Jesus says, no, that's not what it means to follow me. If you're going to follow me, you got to lean in, you got to dig deep, and you got to serve the least of those among us. You see, I love that the identity of the beloved disciple is never revealed. Because to me, it points us to the understanding, the knowledge that we are the ones whom Jesus loves. That we are the ones that Jesus calls, that we are the ones that are the beloved disciples. And so may you know beyond a shadow of a doubt that you are a child of God, that you are a beloved disciple, that you have a call that has been placed upon your life to follow the one that we call Christ. Because he invites us into a new way of living. He invites us into a new way of being that brings light and life to this world. And so, church, may we live in such a way that others will know whom we follow, and that they will know of the love of Christ because of the way that we live.